Hello, my name is Liz Fisher. This is my COMS 534 media evaluation presentation. The movies I'll be evaluating are Belle and A Walk to Remember. Also, please forgive my surroundings. We are at my in-laws' house, and so just trying to make do with the space available. But with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So as you can see on the screen, I did include the movie posters for each of the movies. I just think it helps give some context and a brief introduction for each of the movies. So the movie I'll be starting out by evaluating first is Belle. In case you haven't seen the movie Belle, it does take place in 18th century England. It is about an African American woman who is of mixed race. Her mother is African American, her father is an officer in the British Navy, and her father travels to the East Indies, I believe, either the East or the West Indies, I don't remember which one it is, probably the East Indies, and retrieves her after her mother dies and brings her back to England to live with her rich aunt and uncle while he is away. And while he's away, she grows up with her white cousin and is a part of this family. And then her father dies unexpectedly, leaving her with a huge inheritance to her name. And so then the rest of the movie is her trying to navigate being a wealthy woman financially, but having no status because of the color of her skin. And so that's kind of a brief synopsis of the movie. And my evaluation of each of the creative departments used throughout the film, I personally feel that this movie used the creative departments very well, and I'll start by evaluating the art department used, or how the art department was used. First of all, the costumes and the props used I felt were very fitting of the time period in which the movie was set to take place, 18th century England. As you can see in the picture on the right on the screen, the costumes are very authentic, very realistic. You wouldn't think that it was a modern adaptation because the costumes are very fitting of upper class 18th century English, the upper class in 18th century England. One thing I did notice about the colors used for some of the characters' costumes, particularly Belle and her cousin Elizabeth, throughout the course of the movie, Belle primarily wears pink and purple, not really with much deviation from that, and her cousin Elizabeth primarily wears only the color blue with a little bit of deviation, but those are their primary colors, and I don't know exactly why that is, but that was something I noticed was Belle's costumes tended to be more pink and purple, and Elizabeth's tend to be blue. Another aspect of the art department that I noticed was the scenery. I thought that the scenery was very well chosen. It didn't seem like a lot of the scenery was built from hand. It seemed like they utilized like estates and houses that were already existing in England. I believe during one scene, they actually used the Queen's house, which is very popular for British films. So I felt that the scenery they chose for all of the scenes was very fitting. And the camera angles that they used to capture all of the scenery was also very fitting. And by contrast to the sweeping estates of the high society in England, like for those scenes, they also chose scenery to depict the East Indies, where her father finds Belle, and also scenery to depict a very grimy, very sad, dingy London scene, and all was very applicable in 18th century England. So everything about the art department just seemed very authentic. The next department that I want to evaluate is the camera department. Throughout watching the film, I didn't feel like there was a large variety of different shots used, but the types of shots that were used, I felt were used very effectively. The first shot that I noticed was the over-the-shoulder shot. I noticed that this shot was used primarily when two characters were having an intimate discussion. So it was used a lot when Belle was talking to her family, or when Belle was talking to the man she was interested in, John. But it was not really used when characters were having just kind of like a peer-to-peer discussion. It was really reserved more for when characters having an intimate conversation. And I did include a link to a clip where Belle is talking to John, and they utilize that over the shoulder where you can see Belle in the corner of the screen, but it's focused on John because they are having that intimate discussion. Another type of shot that was used is the long shot, and there's an example of that in the above image on the right. The long shot was not used very often, but when it was, I felt that it was used to give the audience more of a full body view of the characters, and it felt like it was used more to provide the audience with a more objective feeling of the scene, not really like in the midst of the conversation, but more as an outside observer looking on the scene. The shot that was used primarily throughout the movie was the medium shot, for obvious reasons. It's not too intimate, but it's also not too distant. So that was the shot that was primarily used. And then the last shot that I noticed was the medium close shot, which is depicted in the image on the right, but the below image. I noticed that this shot was used a lot when conversations, or it was used for a lot of conversation scenes, but it again was not for those intimate, close conversations. It was more like peer conversations, or in the image on the right, just a walking conversation between Elizabeth and her uncle. Another aspect of the camera department is the lighting that was used. I thought that this was used very effectively. The lighting was very dim whenever the scene was somber or more serious in nature, but whenever the scene was more jovial and happy, such as at the beginning when Belle and her cousin are children and they're playing around and laughing, the lighting is very bright and definitely communicates that sense of lightheartedness to the audience. The next department I want to evaluate is the editorial and the visual effects department. Not a whole lot used in this department. The first point I want to talk about are the scene changes. The primary type of scene change or scene transition that was used was just the straight cut from scene to scene. There were some scene dissolves like into the next scene, but those were very limited, and I didn't really notice a rhyme or reason for when those were used. I'm sure that there was, but I couldn't quite pick up on the logic behind that, but I did notice that there were dissolve transitions used. One visual effect that I did notice was the illusion of depth, which is shown in the image on the right. I believe this scene is the one that is shot at the Queen's house, and this scene is where Belle and her family are at an evening gala, or maybe it was just a party, and Belle at one point is having a close conversation with John, the man she's interested in, which is actually what this picture is depicting. And what I noticed is that the background of this image is a little bit foggy and distorted, making it seem like the people in the background are much farther away than they probably are. But I believe that the purpose of that was so that the audience would focus more on Belle and John in the foreground and give that perception of distance between them and the people in the background. The final department I want to evaluate in regards to Belle is the sound and music department. First of all, I love the soundtrack to Belle. I listened to it a lot. I actually listened to it after I watched Belle, and then as I was creating this presentation, I listened to Belle in the background, just because it's very much a soundtrack that is not imposing. It fits very nicely into the background of action. So whenever I'm doing something, I'll sometimes put on the Belle soundtrack, because it is very unassuming, but it's a good mood creator, and that's something I noticed of the soundtrack in the movie. Actually, the general motifs of the soundtrack are very gentle, very lilting, not necessarily happy, but like the whole soundtrack is very much in a major key, very few minor key moments. So even when a scene is more somber, the music is still in a major key, but just much more subtle and more quiet. There are moments throughout the movie where the music just drops out altogether, and I noticed that those seem to be when there are key lines being delivered, except for during the climax, when there's a lot of emotion going on in that scene, and the music is very strong, very, very loud, actually, almost competing with the dialogue that's occurring. It's definitely very emotional. It adds to that very intense feeling of the climax scene. And then another aspect of the musical score was at the end of the movie, when the plot has been resolved. The motif is very triumphant and very grandiose, giving the audience that sense of triumph, really, that the people have won. And that is all that I have to say about Belle. So the next movie I will evaluate, of course, is A Walk to Remember. And then at the end, I'll compare it to the creative departments used in Belle. But to first evaluate A Walk to Remember, I'll start again with the art department. I felt that A Walk to Remember, so to give a brief summary of A Walk to Remember, it's a Nicholas Sparks movie, and Jamie, the pastor's daughter, actually focuses more on Landon, who's the school bad boy in 2002, and he meets Jamie, the pastor's daughter, after he's gotten in a lot of trouble, and Jamie's very sheltered, very conservative, is in stark contrast to him, and throughout the course of the movie, they start to become friends, and then they become romantically involved, but at the end of the movie, Jamie does die, but the movie is more of a tale of redemption, especially for Landon, and how Jamie plays a part in that. So the first creative department I want to talk about is the art department again. I felt that the creative departments used throughout A Walk to Remember were much more heavily used, in the sense that I could tell that the creative departments were very focused on creating a certain feel for each character, and creating a certain perception of each character for the audience. So for example, with the costumes, Jamie, who is the pastor's daughter, is very conservative, very modest, and her costumes communicate that as well. Her costumes are generally pretty frumpy, kind of dowdy, not modern, not trendy at all, very much unassuming. And by contrast, Landon, who is again the cool kid on the block in 2002, his costumes are always very, very hip, very cool, effortlessly cool, it seemed. But it was interesting to see how even his attire transforms by the end of the movie, after Jamie dies, and 4 years after that, when he has made it into medical school, how his costume changes from the cool kid on the block to the mature, conservative adult that he becomes. And then Landon's friends, who are pictured in the image on the right below, their characters are all very risky, very risque, definitely a bad influence on Landon, and their costumes throughout the movie are generally very rebellious, very like pushing the limits. So that was one aspect where I noticed that the art department took the characters' personalities and focused very heavily on attributing those personalities in the characters' costumes. Another aspect of the art department, again, is the scenery. There were a variety of types of scenery and sets used, where unlike Belle, where there really were not any, it didn't seem like there were any sets that were built. You could definitely tell that a lot of the scenery and the sets used in A Walk to Remember were probably built. One scene at the very beginning is at an industrial plant. It's the opening scene, and it's a very intense moment. They bully a kid to jump off of a bridge or something as a hazing ritual, and so the scenery for that scene is very dark, very grim, and definitely communicating the sense that this is not a very happy scene. And then in contrast to that, the pastor's house, again, the pastor and Jamie are viewed by Landon as being very backwards, very antiquated, very dowdy. And so the scene with the pastor's house is itself pretty antiquated, dusty, kind of communicating Landon's view of Christianity and Jamie and her father. And my favorite type of scenery that was used in this film is at the very end, when Jamie and Landon get married. Jamie has already told Landon earlier in the movie that she wants to someday get married in the chapel where her mom was raised. And at the end of the movie, they show this beautiful chapel, very clean, very simple, with beautiful gardens around it. Just beautiful scenery to communicate this this feeling of intimate romantic love between them as they're getting married. I felt that a lot of props were used and used strategically. For example, Landon's car throughout the movie, when Landon is still the cool kid, he drives a very cool, sporty car. But then by the end of the movie, when he has transformed as a character, he's shown driving a mid-size SUV, very practical, very conservative. In addition, one object that I view more as a prop and not really as a costume element is one of Jamie's sweaters. So this sweater is a gift from Landon to Jamie because she only has one sweater, so he buys her another one. And I felt that this sweater was used more as a prop because Jamie really is only shown wearing this sweater whenever she is in a scene with Landon. So I felt that was more of a prop and was used to communicate Jamie and Landon's relationship with each other, since it was a gift from him to her. The next department that I want to evaluate is, again, the camera department. This is very, very symmetrical presentation, evaluating the departments in the same order. So with the camera department, there were a variety of different shots used. A few that I wanted to focus on. Well, the first type of shot that I want to focus on are the variety of shots used just between Landon and Jamie. So at the beginning of the movie, when Landon and Jamie are polar opposites, really don't even really know each other, the shots used for the scenes where they are together are more the medium long shots, medium to medium long shots where they are not yet very close, very intimate, but as the movie progresses and their relationship develops and they become more close, the types of shots used become more medium to medium close. And to me, that created more of a sense of closeness between them for the audience. The next type of shot that I wanted to evaluate is the close-up shot that was used. There were not many close-up shots used, but when they were used, they were more for dramatic moments in the movie. So, for example, there's one moment where Landon's old friends have done something very cruel to Jamie. They're shaming her at school. And so the camera focuses in on Jamie's face, capturing all of her minute facial expressions, how she's reacting to this type of shaming. And then the other moment in the movie where the close-up shot is used is right after Jamie tells Landon that she has leukemia, and he is driving around trying to process this information. They use the close-up shots to focus in on Landon's face as he's again expressing minute facial expressions. You're almost getting a sense of what Landon is thinking and feeling because the camera is so close in on his face, and the audience feels like they are right there in the car with Landon as he's trying to sort through these emotions. There were long shots used, not very often, because there weren't very many solely scenery shots used. But whenever there was a scenery shot, like at the end with the chapel, then the camera shot used was a long shot. As with Belle, the primary type of shot used is the medium shot, as depicted in the picture on the right, although this might be more of a medium long shot, but still it was more still within the medium range. And something I noticed throughout the movie was whenever a character, like one of the younger characters, was having a discussion with an authority figure, such as the pastor or the principal, the type of shot used is a little bit farther out, kind of creating that sense of distance between the characters and between the audience and the characters. But whenever the characters are having a peer discussion, so whenever the high school kids are talking to each other, the camera shots are generally more medium or medium close. The next department I'll evaluate is the editorial and visual effects department. I noticed that there were a lot more visual effects used in A Walk to Remember than in Belle. I don't necessarily know that there was a lot of CGI used, but you could definitely tell that there were more special effects utilized throughout A Walk to Remember. But I'll start by evaluating the scene changes that were used. There were different types of scene transitions used in A Walk to Remember, more of a variety than in Belle. For example, A Walk to Remember utilized the fade out to black and then obviously fade in to the next scene. They use that several times for a scene transition. They also used the dissolve shot, but what I noticed was they primarily used the dissolve shot within a scene to try to kind of dissolve from an angle on one character and dissolve into an angle on another character, dissolve back to that character, creating that simile shot and that sense of continuity, sense of sameness between the different angles within a certain scene. But as with Belle, the primary scene transition used was the just straight cut from scene to scene to scene. The primary visual effect that I noticed was whenever the characters were looking through a telescope and looking at the stars, it was very obvious that the view through the telescope was either computer generated or just a special effect. It was obviously not the actual sky. Um, and then another visual effect that they used was the illusion of distance. They used this at least one time. One scene where Jamie and Landon are on a date and they're sitting at an outdoor restaurant and they're sitting on like a grassy area and there's a lake in the background. The background is kind of fuzzy, kind of distorted, making it seem like they're much farther away than they probably actually were. And then the last department I'll evaluate is the sound and music department. Again, I just noticed that the sound and the music was used very strategically throughout A Walk to Remember to create certain moods and associations for certain characters. So, for example, throughout the beginning and maybe even first half of the movie, whenever Landon or his friends enter a scene, there's loud punk rock music playing. But then as Landon changes and becomes more close to God through Jamie, his entrance music, if you will, is much more subdued. And then by the end of the movie, it's almost Christian. And so that was something I noticed where Landon's musical associations also change throughout the movie as he does. So very strategic on the music department's part. The orchestra throughout the movie is much more of a background element, not really a focus of each scene. But it is obviously used to create certain moods in certain scenes. The one time in the movie where the music is used as the focal point is during the school play when Jamie sings the now very popular song Only Hope. And that was what I noticed really the only time when the music was used as a focal point for a scene. So that concludes my individual analysis of each movie. So now I get to kind of compare which film I feel used all the creative departments most effectively. And I feel like A Walk to Remember used the creative departments more. Obviously, they used very strategic elements in each department. The sound, the costumes, the camera angles, they used them very strategically to create certain moods. So that was something that Walk to Remember did well. But my conclusion is I believe that the film Belle used all of the creative departments as a whole more effectively. I felt that the overall mood and the overall creative themes throughout Belle were much more effective. Even though A Walk to Remember used more, sometimes less is more. And that was what I felt was true of Belle, where they didn't necessarily use a lot or a variety of different shots or a variety of different musical motifs, but those that were used very strategically and very effectively, which is why I believe that the film Belle, compared to A Walk to Remember, was more effective in utilizing all of the creative departments. So that concludes my presentation. I hope you have a great rest of your day.